Expanding Mind with Erik Davis, Thursdays at 2 p.m. on the Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. Pictures of this. I still remember when I was reading the Village Voice, I think it was the VLS, in the early 1990s, and there was an article by Gary, Indiana, about this fellow named Rudy Wurlitzer, and it showed this photograph of Rudy Wurlitzer. I think he was standing in a field, and he had this kind of haunted hippie look that was immediately appealing. And the article went on to give a little picture of this fellow's fascinating, wonderful, creative life that involved one of my favorite novels, or what became one of my favorite novels, Nog, which came out in the late 60s, his first book. And it's kind of a experimental novel, but it's deeply saturated with the counterculture. I think of it kind of as like a psychedelic hippie Beckett. And the main character kind of is sort of barely holding on to his identity, and he keeps moving through these weird scenes, and you end in a kind of like, a bunch of sort of, not Manson-esque, but that kind of like dark, anarchic, scuzzy hippies in a Western scene, and so there are these weird themes of the West that go through it. And when I tracked it down, because at that point it was out of print and very hard to find, it was I loved it. And then it turned out that Rudy Wurlitzer was also involved with one of my favorite films, which is Two Lane Blacktop, Monty Hellman's early 70s film that stars, yes, indeed, both James Taylor and I'm spacing on his name, the Brian Wilson's brother, Dennis Wilson from the Beach Boys. But nonetheless, it is a deeply profound, fascinating, wonderful, must-see, a kind of Zen koan set in American speed culture. And Rudy went on to do a number of screenplays while also writing some more experimental novels in the 70s, and then has had a wonderful career of writing really a variety of great things, and I got to get to know him a little bit. And he weaves together a number of themes that totally fascinate me and that have come up at least some of the time on this show, one of which is just the whole question of identity. And he's drawn a lot from Buddhism. He practiced a lot of Buddhism in the 70s, like a lot of people in his generation, and that has woven through his texts and his screenplays and books in a number of interesting ways. He wrote one memoir about traveling to Buddhist countries in the East called Hard Travel to Sacred Places, that is a very harrowing Buddhist memoir, not your how to be happy in your workplace kind of Buddhism. And at the same time, he's completely obsessed with the Wild West, and has worked with Sam Peckinpah and the whole world of the Western. So it's just for me, like a perfectly delicious mixture. And we're getting him on the show here, so everyone's set up. But before we bring Rudy on, let's introduce our co-host here, Maja Daou. Maja, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Erik. How are you?
Hey, Maja, have you seen Two Lane Blacktop?
I totally haven't, but just listening to your description, it sounds kind of like El Topo-y. It sounds good.
Yeah, but it's sort of like if El Topo is the maximalist, like hippie spiritual, or freak is better than hippie. Freak spiritual from the 70s, where everything is in excess. Two Lane Blacktop is the kind of Zen minimalism. It's very pared down. There's very little dialogue. There's no supernatural things happen, but it's like totally on the vibe. So it's definitely worth seeing.
Move.
All right, so we're going to get on. I'm so happy that Rudy was able to make time to get on Expanding Mind. We've been in email contact, but have yet to speak. So, Rudy, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So where are you? You're in New York right now?
Yeah, I'm on the floor looking at the ceiling, and here we are.
Here we are. Here we are.
Degrees,
and then
yeah.
are they still squeezing work out of you? Are you still laboring in this creative endeavor that you've been off and on engaged in for so long?
Well, it depends on what how you define the squeeze. I mean, there are a few squeezes from the celluloid trail, which I'm doing my best to ignore, but there are more internal squeezes about maybe writing another book. So the squeeze is always around.
So how do you find, like, when you're in this situation with all these different possibilities, what ends up making the decision about what you do?
Well, that's a good question. I try to run away, for one thing, and not be squeezed, you know. And at this stage of life, you know, now that I'm sitting on that long bench in front of the Trails End Saloon, I try to just do what's inside me to do, and what I feel necessary to do to try to understand how I'm thinking. So that sort of leaves out, for the most part, films, although there is a lot of pressure on me to do something with this. I did it a long time ago, many years ago, a script with Antonioni that has resurfaced, and that certain powers that be are trying to get me to come back and update it and all that, but who knows what will happen, you know. In the meantime, I'm going up to Canada and try to get into another book. Wonderful.
Yeah. Will it be humorous?
I hope so. You know, if it's not, I'll be in big trouble, you know.
Well, one of the reasons that we, you know, gave ourselves the excuse to have you on the show is because there's a new audiobook that came out that called Slow Fade, based on the audiobook version of your novel that came out in the 80s, 1984,
right,
I think.
Right.
And I had the opportunity to listen to this thing on. I'm currently going back and forth between Houston and San Francisco often, and so I have a lot of time on the road to listen to audiobooks, which I like to do. I haven't heard that many of them. Most of them are okay, but this one is just fabulous because Will Oldham does it. It's not your average audiobook, even though he is just reading the story. He's a great reader. There's nice little bits of music, and it's an awesome story for that medium. Like, some books don't really work very well. Some books work really well, and this one was really quite a treat. But I suspect that for you, it must be really weird when something that you did, like, decades ago kind of, like, returns in the world, and people are talking about it, and you're like, what was that thing? How is that for you, having Slow Fade suddenly, like, reappear in the cultural milieu?
Yeah, that really happened. I mean, I had to sit down and read the bloody book again, and I thought, wow, it's not so bad. And the guy that read the audio and was very enthusiastic about the book, Will Oldham, who's a singer-songwriter out of the South, and who has a following, and when he's on the road he calls himself Bonnie Prince Billy. But he was tremendously enthusiastic about the book, and he went around giving readings of it, and he came to my hometown of Hudson, New York, and wanted to do a reading with me, and go to a few other places in New York and do a reading. And it was extremely interesting because I thought, wow, you know, I've always been sort of shy about giving readings. It's sort of painful for an old geezer to get up and read his books. It's sort of boring, you know, and self-conscious. But the way Will approached it was really interesting, and it reminded me of the 60s and doing happenings with people like Oldenburg and Rauschenberg. So we invented a kind of form, whereas I read with Will and a few times and once with another guy, so that sort of broke up the the one voice reading, and it was kind of more theatrical. And then he had a guitarist that played chords in the background, and then my wife, who's a photographer, Lynn Davis, showed about 120 largely blown up images on slides of locations that were resonated with the book. They weren't about the book, but they were taken in places like the West and India and the far north, Labrador, Greenland, etc. So that became a kind of performance, and it worked for me. And it was, people seemed to have a good time, and I wasn't so embarrassed. And so in terms of the audio, in terms of the extension of the audio into an actual reading thing, it seemed to work. So
that's wonderful that you got to work out. I mean, I've had a few experiences of doing readings with music and some visuals around it, and it's really like a wonderful opportunity. And I wish people would do it a little bit more often, because unless you're a really magnificent reader, the form of the book reading is a slow boat.
It really is. It's a deadly process. I mean, and this originated with a while ago when my wife had a show at her gallery in New York, and then a book signing. She did a book called Sacred Landscapes, and the lineup was in front of the table to get the signed books and everything. It was sort of deadly, and in the middle of all this, her friend Patti Smith came and rescued the whole evening by singing 4 songs. And everyone had a great time, and and the book was fine, and people got it. But also there was another chord involved, and so that gave me the idea of doing this with Will, So hopefully,
there is a kind of new movement towards that in general. I mean, even like with Will Oldman, my friend Sammy Harcum, he runs a bookstore called Family here in Los Angeles, and they get musicians and readers to read the books, and they have musicians play, and it's kind of like, to me, it reminds me of like The Last Poets, where they'll have like a visual show and then music and then readers, and I really think it makes it like a happening, like literally.
Yeah,
so.
It really does. It's really great. So I was very enthused about that. So it sort of saved the day for me, And then we went down to New York to read. Down there, they were doing a week's at the film anthology of my early films, which I found it kind of painful, but the reading saved it, of the book, So.
Well, it's funny having you on because, on the one hand, the cultural historian in me wants to ask you about all the stuff that you've gone through and all the what is your where was your identity in 1966? What was your experience of this? And tell me about the Dudjom Rinpoche in the 70s or whatever. And at the same time, it seems kind of funny in a way because a lot of your work is so, whether it's more accessible stories like Slow Fade that are funny and that have narratives that are you can latch onto, or some of your more experimental work, it's always about the slipperiness of identity, which is, if you say it that way, it just sounds like kind of a general theme in postmodern fiction, blah, blah, blah. But with your stuff, you really feel it. You're really you could tell that the guy who's writing this book is sitting there going who am I actually? How does this thing happen? So it's a funny thing for an interviewer. So what's going on with you?
It's kind of timeless. I mean, who am I? That's an ongoing theme. I'm lying here now wondering who the hell I am. So, in terms of the 60s, my God, I can't even remember,
The one thing I did want to ask about in terms of that is a theme in Slow Fade is that some of the characters find themselves in India and they go through a kind of spiritual seeking scene, and then there's a Tibetan teacher who they discover, and then part of the story happens with their, I wouldn't say disenchantment exactly, it's more complicated than that, but certainly the complexities of that seeker world. And, when you were writing that in the early 80s, there wasn't that much of a real sense outside of there were people who were, still totally on that path, but you were reflecting on it in a really interesting way. And that's the one thing that I would love to have you talk about a little bit, is just your experience of Buddhism. You know, the way that you came at it from such an interesting angle, and it sort of resonated with work you were already doing. But what has that been like, you know, pursuing teachings, going to retreats, but you know, how have you found yourself into, you know, Buddhism or the kind of spiritual search?
It's been a long process, and initially I went to India way back, early 70s, late 60s maybe, with a producer, and I was going to direct a film from a script I had written that was set in India, and I thought, well, man, I better get there and see what it's like, you know. So I went, and the film never got on. But when I was in New Delhi, I met a few lamas and was very affected by them, and it's sort of the chord of their presence kind of stayed with me. And then I went back to India a few years later. A lot of my trips initially to India and other places in far north, etc., were to find a relief from the agonies of the LA film business, you know, and so I would write a script and then try to find some kind of antidote to that process, which was interesting in those days, but also difficult, sort of internally. And then I spent a lot of time in Nepal, maybe 6-7 months, maybe a year, and just kind of hanging out. And that's where I met Dudjom Rinpoche, this venerable old Lama who was head of the Nyingmapa sect. And I went to see a friend of mine, John Giorno, who was studying with him. He was a poet from New York. And I went into this Dudjom Rinpoche's house and was sitting around and just kind of hanging out and not knowing what to do. And John came and said, "Would you like to meet His Holiness?" And I said, "Yeah, that would be great." And Dudjom Rinpoche came into this room and he looked at me and he said, "Well, I guess you better take refuge. You're not good for anything else." So I said, "Okay, yeah, I didn't know I didn't know what it was about, but I did." And then I hung around and went to various teachings. And then when I went back to New York, I was asked to help start a center there, which I did, and then spent a lot of time with him, going back and forth from New York to India, and also his son, Tinley Norval Rinpoche, who's still alive and is a venerable teacher and has written many books. And so it started that way, but it was always sort of spontaneous, you know. I never had a conceptual idea of being a seeker or anything. It just kind of flew up and hit my windshield, so to speak. So gradually, you know, I started to do practice in my lame, half-assed way, and you know, and so I went back and forth and have done so over the years. Although I haven't been to India in a while, in about 10 or 15 years, but the last time I went I did a script for Bertolucci called Little Buddha, and which was a mixed bag, I think, mostly because the people that were making the film were terrified of India and really what it was about. So in terms of the Dharma, but you know, it was what it was, and that was the last time I was there. But
well, that's so funny. I hadn't thought about that. That's one of the threads of slow fade, is the idea that maybe the filmmaker who in the book may go make a film in India, and there's a lot of discussion about how horrible that is, what a production nightmare, and you don't want to do it. And that's funny that you would wind up
it reminds
there.
me. I don't know. Did you guys ever read any of Joseph Campbell's travel journals? Like Joseph Campbell would write about cultures in then you read his travel journals in India, and he's like, this place is terrible, I hate it, everybody's filthy, like, and then he's expounding on the myths, and then yet when he's there, he like says it sucks, basically.
Well, I love India, but it's an assault on a lot. Everything that's repressed in this country seems to be out on the street there, and vice versa. And it's an interesting education to be there, but just in general.
So I've there's a lot of these just spiritual masters from the 70s that for me stir this kind of sense of belatedness, because I came later and I always found that moment to be something really interesting and special happened. It's like there was a lot of cheesy stuff and creepy gurus and dumb things happened, but there was also these characters of a handful of these teachers who were clearly really special people, and they were able to meet people in a sort of somewhat undefined way because of the counterculture, and everything was sort of confusing, and it wasn't like a set thing. Whereas now, I went into a local bookstore the other day. It's it was in San Francisco, admittedly, but it was like a new bookstore, not a used bookstore. I went in there and there was like one shelf of Christianity and like 3 shelves of Buddhism, and it was just everything. Everything was there. Now it's like it's available, it's part of the picture. But there was something there. There was a kind of like a frontier quality. I mean, you're interested in the frontier, but of all these characters, Dudjom Rinpoche always struck me as like that was the one I wish I had actually.
Well, he was the one for me. He was, as soon as I was in his presence, I was just overwhelmed and empowered with. And it was just his presence and his total compassion. I mean, I was just a completely distraught character, and it was just amazing. Just within 10 minutes, I knew that he was the real deal, and so it was a great privilege to be around him in those days, and it was extraordinary. So I'm incredibly grateful to be, as you say, on the frontier of that whole Oriental thing, which was romanticized and all the rest, and but in those days it was very, very unusual and very special, so that was a long relationship that I treasure, Well,
on the other side of that, you also mentioned just the whole living in LA and in the Hollywood scene at that time, and that was also an era of tremendous creativity and also kind of madness, where there were some of these countercultural people and figures and sensibilities and ideas kind of moved in there to the mainstream and sort of reshaped things, and there was this period of tremendous crazy creativity and clearly challenge from everything you always say about working in Hollywood is really a crazy thing, and yet it's still kind of in the picture there somewhere. So what's at root with your love-hate relationship with this place?
Well, in those days, in the late 60s, early 70s, when I went out there, at first I went out there just to finish a book, and it was a very languid, exotic place. I didn't know anyone, so it was great to work there. But then Monty Hellman read a book of mine called Nog, and he was starting up with Slow Fade, and so he called me and asked me to write it. And there was always a kind of very preliminary existing script, but I thought, great. That was a sense of the unknown and adventure. Monty was great, and in those days, and so that was a good experience. And unbelievable, now as I look back at it, it was extraordinarily rare that I was given permission to follow my own instincts and write in my own way. There were no meetings about scripts or anything about what they wanted me to do. I just hung out with a lot of car freaks and sort of invented a form. And I thought, wow, this is great. This is a way that I can support myself to write my crazy books, And it worked for a while into the 70s. And then Peckinpah came along, and that was a crazy experience, but it was interesting because he was really one of the last of the old outlaws, and he was difficult and everything, but he was, in his way, he was totally authentic, and it was an amazing adventure. So that up until, maybe when I did Walker with Alex Cox, that was sort of the end of that period of time when it was a person-to-person relationship with the writer to the director and the powers. The structure then became totally corporate, and inevitably the hierarchies became completely egoic. So that was the big steel curtain came down in the early 80s, and it was just survival from then on. And it took me a while to realize that. And but when LA no longer seemed possible, when you would go into a meeting to do a script and there would be 4 other people in the room, a producer, an agent, a couple of money people, and and you'd have to pitch the script and tell them what you were going to do, and they would give you the notes right there. So by the time you got out of the room, you no longer wanted to do it. It was just not possible. All the sense of your intuitive identity was crushed. So I went to Europe and worked with a few European directors like Volker Schlondorf and Antonioni and various people, and that sort of kept it going for a while. But then by the 90s, it was really all over, so...
Well, I want to ask you a little bit more about Peckinpah, because he's such an important figure also in Slow Fade. But we're going to take a break right now.
Okay.
You're listening to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Erik Davis with Maja Dawu. We're talking with Rudy Wurlitzer, author and screenwriter, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Okay.
This is PRN, the Progressive Radio Network.
Hey, Lee.
Yeah, Jeff?
Your girlfriend gave another interview.
No, don't play it.
Listen to this.
I have a journalism degree. That is what I studied. I understand that this cornerstone of our democracy is a free press.
Shut it off! I said not to play it!
We are in the worst reality show in history.
Why won't she shut up?
You know she's going to be president, right?
Okay, stop it. That's not funny. That's not funny!
I think we should just go limp. Lay back. Maybe then the mama grizzly won't tear off your limbs. Cheater and the Rude. Thursdays, 8 p.m. Progressive Radio Network.
I'm Dr. Len Saputo.
And I'm registered nurse Vicki Saputo. We're proud to announce that the Progressive Radio Network will be bringing you our live call-in talk show, Prescriptions for Health, every Monday afternoon starting June the 6th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Mark your calendars and save up your questions so you can ask us about possible strategies for your health problems, whether mainstream or complementary and alternative.
We also invite your questions and comments about any area of healthcare, including politics, economics, ethics, philosophy, and styles of healthcare.
So remember to tune in every Monday from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to the Progressive Radio Network's Prescriptions for Health show.
Why should you be listening to the Progressive Radio Network? Here are a few hosts that call PRN home. Award-winning investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker Michael Rupert. Acclaimed theoretical physicist Michio Kaku. Notable media critic and international journalist, The News Dissector, Danny Schechter. Leading progressive journalists such as Stephen Ledman, John Rappaport, and Glenn Ford have also found a home with us. We also have advice from Richard Martin on how to protect yourself from the ongoing financial collapse. John Mueller tells us his first-hand account on moving out of the U.S. and making a new life for himself in another country on his show, The Expat Files. Along with all these informative programs, we also have health shows hosted by American America's top doctors like Mayor Eisenstein, Cheryl Selman, and, of course, Gary Null. The Progressive Radio Network is the place for news and information.
Rachel Trachtenberg for Rachel Trachtenberg's Pure Imagination. This is a show for everyone from our perspective as teens. Current events, art as life, music, and politics. Rachel Trachtenberg's Pure Imagination. With co-host Julia Cunning. Wednesdays at 1 p.m. on the Progressive Radio Network. Not bad. Not too shabby.
You are listening to PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind. This is Erik Davis. We're talking here with Rudy Wurlitzer, and before the break, we'd mentioned that you'd worked with Sam Peckinpah some, and he was this very outsized character who kind of appears in a fictionalized form in Slow Fade. But how did that come about? I mean, and not so much just about the story of you meeting him, blah blah blah, but really what that encounter was like in your life, because he was clearly such a powerful kind of character. He had his own kind of, tantric master side, if in a different domain. He was clearly a fiery character, and just about that, and a little bit about the West and the Western and the whole idea of that genre and like what it was that attracted you to that space.
Oh, well, I'd always been interested in the idea of the frontier, because in my own life, I was trying to find a frontier and escape from my traditional upbringing in the East. But so it was kind of romantic for me. But when I was asked to do a script by Gordon Carroll, a producer, to do a Western, I thought, wow, this is something I've always wanted to do. And we kicked around an idea and came up with Billy the Kid, and then added Pat Garrett onto it. And then the first person we thought of was actually it was Monty Hellman, because I had just done that film with him, but it was clear that Monty couldn't get that one on. So then the most obvious person to go to was Sam Peckinpah, and he said yes. So it was very exciting, and I sat down and wrote the script. I was totally free with my first draft. I wrote it off in my place in Cape Breton, Canada, and so I was, in those days, it was a very free and intuitive process writing a script. So it was great for me, and then I came back and gave it to Sam, and he said okay, and they went about the process of casting it, and Sam imposed a few things on the script. One of which was really good, which was to have a setup at the beginning that Pat Garrett and Billy were friends, and to establish that relationship, and then the betrayal of friendship, which is a big thing, was a big thing for Sam Peckinpah. So that was a good take that he introduced to the script. So I felt very good about that. And then things went on, and Sam went down to Mexico to start pre-production, and then the other thing that happened, I was in New York. I had a place on the Lower East Side, and I knew Bob Dylan a little bit, and he came to see me and said, "Wow, man, I hear you're doing Billy the Kid." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I got to tell you, I've always thought I was a reincarnation of Billy the Kid." And I said, "Wow, that's interesting. Unfortunately, the part is already taken. Chris Christopherson is doing it, and he said, "Oh man, that's too bad. Is there any way I can be a part of it?" So he left, and I called the producer and I said, "Look, Dylan, I think Dylan wants to be involved, and he said, "Wow, that's great. We'd get a great soundtrack." He said, "Can you write him a little part?" And I said, "Yeah." So I wrote him a part, and it then mailed it out and said that was cool. And he said, "Well, can you take Bob down to Durango, Mexico, to meet Sam?" And I said, "Yeah." And so we flew down. We got there late at night, and to Durango. The place was shut down. I took a cab out to where Sam was staying outside of town, and we approached the house. And as we approached the house, there was a gunshot, and the maid ran out screaming. So we looked at each other and said, "Wow, this is, I don't know what's going on." So we slowly approached the house, opened the door. There was another shot. This from upstairs in the house. And I called out. There's no one around. I called, Sam, are you? What's going on? There was another shot, and I said, "Well, I got to see what's going on." So we slowly crept up the stairs, and Bob was behind me. We opened the door to Sam's room, and he was standing in front of a full-length mirror, naked, with a pistol in his hand, shooting at his own image. So I said, "Well, I didn't know what, I thought, well, this is, I didn't know what to do." So I said, "Sam, this is Bob Dylan here. I wrote him a part, and he's going to be in the film." And he turned around and looked at us for a long moment, and he said, he looked at Dylan, and he said, "Well, I'm a big Roger Miller fan myself." And I thought, "Oh man, this is it. Dylan's gone." But what happened is that Bob just, thought, "Wow, this guy's great. He's a real outlaw. No one had ever treated him this way." It was fantastic. He just fell in love with him like a puppy, and Peckinpah we sort of insulted him, and Dylan followed him around, and he was very bored, but he managed to get through the length of the film, and he sort of survived, and he did well, so that was that story. But and then he and I sat down to write a script based on Shoot the Piano Player, which I thought we would probably call it Shoot the Director, but we never finished it because I sort of left towards the end. Things got so crazy with Sam. And the other day when they were showing it at the film anthology, I hadn't seen it for about 25 years, so I was looking at it, and I thought it was amazing to me because the script that I had written, I remembered, there was only one big violent part of the script, which was at the end when Pat Garrett kills Billy the Kid. And until then, it was a slow transition towards that, but Sam had introduced, every 10 minutes there were a dozen people that got killed. So it was the Peckinpah stamp, and I thought, wow, it was interesting to see.
Well, Rudy, this makes me kind of think of a question I have for you, and I know a lot of your stuff kind of deals with identity. What, as an artist working through this and seeing your creations like kind of go through that in Hollywood, and as someone who kind of is exploring identity, what effect did that have on your own perception of who you are, seeing that done to your work? Did that affect your identity and ego?
Yeah, it was intense. I mean, I actually left the filming towards the end. I was sort of upset about it, but and when I was seeing these early films at the film anthology, I kept being reminded how sublimated the screenwriter is to the director and to the whole process, and it's inevitable. It's a director's medium, and that's just the way it is. But it takes its price and it takes its toll, and finally I couldn't do it anymore. But the experience with Peckinpah I'm glad I did it. It was worth it, and other films as well in those days. But I didn't know what the toll was going to be then. I was still sort of romantic about the hopes of, collaboration and being in the process, and it was an adventure, and also it was a livelihood, so I didn't really want to teach, so this was a way I could support myself, and I had a certain knack for it, but as time went on, and into the 80s and 90s, it became increasingly difficult, and finally I couldn't do it anymore, and so it sort of ended. But
you keep coming back to the West as well. I mean, you wrote a novel, in the last decade of The Drop Edge of Yonder, based on another screenplay you'd done for a while, and that's just such a wonderful use of the kind of genre of the Western. To write a Western at this point is to be in this echo chamber of all the films we've seen and all the stereotypes and all the cliches, and yet there's something there. There's something still kind of attractive about that genre, even though it doesn't clearly fit our century in quite the same way. Like, they don't make them that often. They're often a little bit weird. Yes, there's Deadwood, whatever. But like, what still attracted you about that genre when it came to Drop Edge of Yonder, and then who knows, maybe you're gonna, you'll do another thing in that domain. I
think I'm burned out with that domain, although I've been asked to write. What happened with the Drop Edge, although you never know, but the Drop Edge of Yonder came because I had done a lot of scripts, a number of scripts that were the seeds of Drop Edge of Yonder, which was called a script called Zebulon, which at one point, even in the early days, very early version, Peckinpah was interested in, and he died. And then Hal Ashby was interested in it, and he died. So it was sort of strange. And then there was a moment when I thought I might direct it, and I took it up to Canada, where I can work as a Canadian. I'm not a citizen, but I'm a landed immigrant, so I thought I could get the money up there, but I couldn't. And then Jim Jarmusch was interested in it, and he sort of took a lot of it and did, which was a surprise to me, used a lot of it for his film Dead Man. And then I thought, well, that's the end of it. I can't. I'm burned out with this one, and then. But it's still the echo of that journey of the West, and that sort of episodic thing, which sort of attracted me in terms of language, and it's almost like a musical rhythm, and also about how you encounter unknown spaces that way, and the whole adventure of it. And for a lot of reasons, I just felt it wasn't finished. So that's why I sat down and wrote The Drop Edge of Yonder, and now I think it's finished. Although strangely, I've been asked to revive that early script and do it another way, but I don't know. I don't think I can.
Well, does that, when you have to undergo a process of that, and when you say it's finished, is that like a part of yourself? You feel like you worked out through doing that, and now you have to like kind of go back and go over that personal experience that you had with it? I mean, how does that affect you?
You mean, how did it affect me with the Drop Edge of Yonder?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I felt it was using all the research that I had done over the years, all the contemplations of that narrative, the whole thing about one of the themes was a sort of Bardo theme about somebody being shot and it's sort of in between life and death, and it involved, a lot of the themes involved me in that sort of adventurous way. So, but after I did the novel, I thought that took care of it. I don't really have to go back to that period in time, and there are other frontiers to investigate. So I probably will do it another way. I'm not really totally hooked on just being a Western genre guy, you know.
No, I think it's more that you were able to play with it. It's really about the bardo and how these like genres can actually function kind of as these imaginal worlds that are haunted by death and ghosts. And you can look at a lot of Western, like kind of with the encouragement of Drop Edge of Yonder, you can look at other Westerns and say, well, actually, they're bardo films. They're not taking place. They're not in reality. That's not reality. They're in some kind of astral world of like death and judgment and remembrance and shamanism and all this kind of stuff. Right. What is it about? Just talk a little bit, because we don't have a lot of time yet, about the bardo, about writing the bardo. Like, what attracts you to that space, and you do it with humor as well. It's not like a heavy thing necessarily, but there's something about that in-betweenness that really runs throughout a lot of stuff you've done.
Well, I've always felt in between, in a sense, I mean, and one of the things that initially, a long time ago, I did an essay on that old Western writer, sort of a hack writer called Louis L'Amour. And I wrote this essay on the first 2 pages of Louis L'Amour, which were just involved about riding into open space without knowing where you were going, sort of the road to nowhere, and where it was without, outside of tradition, outside of a known direction. And that leads itself to a kind of bardo state of being in between one stage or another, or in a transition thing. But bardos exist. We're all in bardos, one way or the other, whether it's in relationships or whatever. I mean, one at times in our lives, So it's not just literally about life, the transition after death to another form of life or energy. Although in Drop Edge of Yonder, it did point to that. But so, the whole theme of bardo theme is also a frontier theme, about leaving one set of descriptions into the unknown towards another form of life, another form of reality, So that plays into the whole idea of the frontier. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I know you probably don't have any maybe nothing concrete to say about it, but I'm just curious how you see yourself. What are you drawn to now as you move forward in creative projects? In terms of this in between state. The great curtain is not that far off for any of us, but you're definitely very aware of that. You mentioned it.
Well, certainly, I find myself sitting on that long bench in front of the Trails End Saloon, pondering what is it that dusk comes, and certainly at this stage of life, one realizes one has only a certain amount of time left. So one becomes involved in thinking in a kind of recapitulation way about where one has been and where and the whole journey. It's like looking back and trying to see the footsteps and what kind of design they formed in terms of the journey that one has been on. And then towards one's own mortality and one's a whole sense of impermanence. So that lends itself to, in a crude sense, towards, which would be a kind of memoir form, but I would have to mess around with that one, I'm sure, and break a lot of the traditional ways of dealing with that. But that would, in the process, would also become involved with the bardo once again, about one form leading to another and what it's like to be in the middle of that journey,
Yeah, that's powerful stuff. I really encourage you. I mean, I still think, a lot of your work's really, really great for me, but the Hard Travel to Sacred Places, which is a kind of, memoir that breaks the form, or in a lot of ways, especially for a spiritual memoir, which are usually, I was lost and now I'm found kind of things, or I was lost, now I'm found, I'm slightly disappointed, but, we carry on. And you really brought just the heaviest issues of life and death and confusion and loss and disenchantment, and put it into that kind of spiritual context of these places and these wonderful sacred sites and the whole kind of romance of the East or whatever. And so I'm sure I'm sure there's so much material in your life, in that track through the sand, to do that kind of work. But it must be kind of funny too when you look back and you can watch your own mind try to tell a new story about how the story happened. It's like it's never a fixed thing. It's like you look back and there's oh, now I see that the pattern of all the things I did was leading here, or that was the theme. And you're like, yeah, but that's always changing. So what is it?
Well, that's where fiction comes in. So then you invent a narrative or a story that reflects that, and maybe I can break up the traditional memoir form with a lot of things like that, different kinds of ways of looking at it. Sam Shepard wrote an interesting book, his last book, that dealt with that kind of thing, and so there are ways to you want to. I always feel it's necessary to create a new form. I'm not one that feels comfortable with just hanging on to old forms, so who knows what would happen. But it's the only way for me to proceed is when my mind becomes completely empty and I'm faced with the unknown, and my instincts can sort of direct me in some way. But that takes a long time. I always spend a long time between books, unfortunately. I can't.
One more question, because we're wrapping up here. I know you're about to go to the north. Is it Nova Scotia where you have property, or
up in Cape Breton, which is in northern part of Nova Scotia.
I know that's a really important place for you. It comes up again at the end of Slow Fade. Just tell me a little bit about what it's like to really kind of get away from a lot of this stuff and be returning to such a place of remarkable nature for so long.
Well, it's great. It saved me. I've had this place for 40 years, and I've always gone up there to regenerate and sort of stare at the big empty, so to speak, and be inside a realm, a zone of silence where nature is very, very present, wind, sea, and sky, and it's really off the grid, so off the cultural grid and every other kind of grid, so I can really, for the most part, be alone. Sometimes lately it gets a little crowded there in August, but then it dies out and it's great, so it's been a refuge for me, and I went up there in the early days and bought this piece of land with Phil Glass, the composer, and he still comes up occasionally, and then we have separate houses and everything, but it's a great place to work and to deal with the non-duality of form and emptiness.
Well, that's a great place to end. So, Rudy, thanks so much for being on the show. It's been great to kind of meet you in this format, and I encourage readers to go out there and read his books. Go see Tulane Blacktop, see Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. I love your stuff, and really good luck on whatever your next project
is.
Thank
you, Erik. You're a great support, and I appreciate it and love your work. So we'll talk soon.
All right. Well, this is Erik Davis with Majidau. We've been talking with Rudy Wurlitzer here on the Progressive Radio Network. And from all of us, keep your minds open.